Rhetoric, in its simplest definition, is the art of persuasion. So how? How do we do that? How do we engage the reader, the listener?
Hello, and welcome to the Arts of Language podcast with Andrew Pudewa, founder of the Institute for Excellence in Writing, or as many like to say, IEW. My name is Julie Walker, and I'm honored to serve Andrew and IEW as the Director of Marketing. Our goal is to equip teachers and teaching parents with methods and materials which will aid them in training their students to become confident and competent communicators and thinkers. Well, hello, Andrew. Today we're going to talk about something that you had mentioned that we should talk about in a podcast. I'm sure there's an English verb tense for that, where we're going to talk about something in the future, but we recorded that in the past.
Well, if when we recorded it, I said we will have discussed sometime in the future, then that would be future perfect tense.
Okay.
But I don't think that's what it was.
No, I think it was more like, hey, this is a really great idea. We should talk about this at a future podcast.
Yes.
What tense is that?
But if I were seeing, well, that would just be present tense.
Okay.
We should. Well, conditional.
Okay.
Or subjunctive. We don't think about that much in English, do we? But in this case, this morning we were talking about what podcast we would do today.
'Tis true.
Because sometime in the last year, we had been talking about persuasion.
That
right. Would be the pluperfect. Before this morning, we had been. Maybe we're just doing obscure grammar tenses.
That's right. So in case you wanted to know, listener, whether or not Andrew knows grammar, he does. So there we go.
I know grammar exists.
Yes, and we'll put a link in the show notes to Andrew's talk. But what about grammar? And but
I need to
having
listen to
said
that
all
one.
that, yes, having said all that, you had suggested that we have a conversation about influence and persuasion.
Yes. Well, persuasive writing is quite the buzz. Mm-hmm. Very often you'll look at state standards or published standards that want to have students do persuasive writing. And then they will have students practice with all sorts of prompts, such as, do you think the students in the school should have to clean the school? Argue for or against this position. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of an exercise. So, what's the goal? If you're setting a standard for students to do persuasive writing, what are you hoping they will learn?
I must confess that when you said, what's the standard, I was thinking of cleaning the school. I mean, that would be pretty difficult to get kids to clean the school, right?
To a very high standard?
To a very high standard. Sorry. So what is the standard?
What is the goal?
Right.
If this is the standard, we want nth graders to be able to do persuasive writing. Mm-hmm. How do you define that? Mm-hmm. How do you teach it? How do you determine whether they were successful? And, ultimately, what's the whole purpose of this as a standard?
Right.
It's like we actually need to teach middle school students how to argue.
I think they're pretty good at it.
Well, they are, but maybe if we taught them to do it in a better way, then they would understand the art of argument. Mm-hmm. And they would understand the art of persuasion.
Ah.
And, of course, what's the value of understanding that?
Well, you can get what you want.
Maybe.
But ultimately, I think it would be being able to understand the different tactics, if you would say it that way, that might be being used on you to persuade you to do something.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So it's like a game of chess, right? I mean, you're in marketing.
Yeah, it's true. I love this conversation.
So it's all about persuasion, but there's tricks and then there's truth.
Right.
And then there's tricks to use truth, and then there's truthless tricks.
Which we try not to use in our promotional strategies,
Sure,
letting
of course
people know
not.
who we are.
Yeah,
Right.
No, I mean,
we want to be authentic.
We believe that we are a high integrity company
Yes.
and that everything we sell has value and that everything we sell is worth what people pay for it. And then our task is to convince people to notice that, I guess.
Right.
Or not even to convince them, to just
Right.
lead them. But there are some principles that we would use.
Right. And I remember sitting in your office, 10 years ago, and you handed me this article on the art of persuasion.
Yeah, I think it was actually called The Science of Persuasion.
Right, exactly.
Which is interesting because you could go on a rabbit trail here, the difference between an art and a science. But it was in Scientific American Mind back in 2004.
Oh, okay.
And I remember reading it and thinking, wow, that is very useful. Useful on a practical level of just having a product and providing it to the world. It's useful for teaching kids who are involved in, say, competitive speech or debate, mock trial, things like that. And of course, from the study of rhetoric, there's the ancient kind of classical rhetoric approach. And then there's the more modern, scientifically supported rhetoric approach. And there's a huge overlap between the two.
Right, right.
And I thought this is kind of that. So one of the things that I notice is that a lot of people use this term persuasive writing, and then they define it as have an opinion and give reasons for your opinion. Although, does that really persuade anyone? I suppose if the reasons were overwhelmingly compelling, it might. But it's not a very strategic way to go about shifting an opinion.
Right.
If you have a strong opinion and you're trying to persuade someone, the odds are the person you're trying to persuade has a different opinion. If theirs was the same, you wouldn't be trying to persuade them. You'd be having a mutual appreciation for what you believe discussion.
Right.
Or a cheerleading club.
Right.
But to shift an opinion, you have to do a whole lot more than just give reasons as to why you think something. So I believe a lot of what is done in the world of persuasive writing prompts and teaching persuasive writing is not actually that. In a similar way to you're almost in a death trap when you say we're going to teach critical thinking, because who can define it?
Right.
How do you teach it? There's so many people who have so many different opinions with so varied levels of effectiveness.
Right. And we've had podcasts on critical thinking in the past.
Yes, we have. So
whatever that is.
I would try to define, and I think we do in our Unit 8 materials, argumentative writing is when you say, here's what I think and here's the reasons. You argue, but you're not necessarily doing it in such a way that you believe it would change the opinion.
Right. You're not being very persuasive. You're just arguing.
Right. So rhetoric, in its simplest definition, is the art of persuasion. So how do we do that? How do we engage the reader, the listener? Well, probably the simple principle we teach is the starting point in Unit 8, and that is, rather than make a thesis statement, rather than tell the reader, this is what I believe, this is my opinion, here's the perspective I'm going to argue, shift and change that into a question.
Right.
Because that draws the reader in. And And I always tease the high school students, and I say, well, let's say I had an opinion that the driving age in the United States, in all 50 states, should be raised to 18 years old. Okay, if that's my opinion, and I say that in the first few sentences of an editorial or an essay or something, who's going to read it?
The students, the kids, the adults who believe that should.
Yeah, the few people that could say, oh, wow, that sounds like a great idea. Let's see why he thinks that.
Right.
Who's going to throw it in the garbage?
Anybody who's probably a 16-year-old wanting to get their license.
Exactly. So I just use that as an illustration. Mm-hmm. And one of the problems with writing is in the real world, we don't have a captive audience. Mm. You know, if I walk in and give a talk in a lecture hall, I have pretty much a captive audience. There may be a few people who are bold enough to stand up and walk out in a huff. Right. But for the most part, people are there. They can't easily close their ears. They're kind of forced to hear me. Mm-hmm. But if I send something in writing, well, I've got no captivity at all. Mm-hmm. They will decide in a very short period of time whether this looks interesting and worth reading or not. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so that's why we would recommend then that first step of persuasive writing, begin with a question.
Right.
Draw the reader in, because then the reader wants to know, oh, okay, is this person smart like me or stupid like everybody else? It's kind of human nature.
Right, right.
We seek to hear things that support what we believe and know. Mm-hmm. We're very cautious when we hear things that challenge what we believe or know. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's human nature. So if someone wants to change our belief, it's got to be a gentle but strategic process.
Right.
So this guy, Robert Cialdini, I believe is how you would pronounce it, came up with these 6 elements of persuasion that I thought, well, we use these in marketing. We use these in parenting. Oh, my. Mm-hmm. We use these in teaching. And we use some of these in writing as well. So I don't know what order they were in the original article, but we can just go down the list I have here. The first one is reciprocity. So that just means receiving, reciprocity, receiving and giving. So, if I give you something, you will subconsciously believe that you need to do something for me.
And it's difficult to not do that.
It is difficult.
I got my sister a Christmas present this year, and I told her she was not allowed to get me a present back just because I wanted to thank her with this Christmas present. And that was difficult for her. But reciprocity, very powerful.
Well, but now she's got to sit around and think about how to give something back to you that isn't a Christmas present.
Right.
But certain cultures, this is so deeply ingrained. I lived in Japan for several years, and it's gift-giving showdown to the death.
Yes. My husband's half Japanese. We benefited from their generosity. I don't think I understood the nuances of reciprocity, at least in the Japanese culture when we first got married.
But we use this in marketing. Someone says, here, have a free download of this. And we get it and we think, oh, thank you. I'm more likely to say, oh, I'll buy something, from them.
Or at least give them a second look.
Yeah, or we share freely, and that creates a desire for people to give back something.
Right.
Why do we get the loads and loads of unsolicited testimonial notes?
Why do we?
Yeah,
because people are really grateful.
They're grateful
for the wonderful lessons they've learned from us.
Yeah, so it's a human compulsion to.
So they've received something from us, and so in turn they're paying us back, so to speak, with their testimonial.
Right.
And of course we're compelled to say, "Oh, thank you for saying that," and then we want
to give them a free thing for taking the time to. Right. Yeah. So that's a principle of moving someone. It also works in a rhetorical way where you give a little bit of ground. Right.
Oh,
so,
right.
I have this type of opinion. Well, I can understand how people may have a different feeling on this or a different view or a different perspective. So I can empathize, right? So empathy and reciprocity are connected to some degree. However, if we step back and look at it from this different angle, right? Rather than saying, I'm quite sure your opinion is wrong. Now, please look at it at my angle, right? So nobody likes to hear that.
Right.
So that reciprocity works in the marketing world. It works in the social world. And in the rhetorical world, we can look at it as an openness to acknowledging the opposing view.
And I would say to teachers, when I watch you teach, Andrew, you're teaching a group of students and you are kind to them, you affirm them, and sometimes there's a little bit of mischief happening, and you just ignore that. And you give affirmation to those who are doing good, and they in turn want to get affirmation from you. So there's a reciprocity right there, and the students who might be mischievous will say, "Oh, I want some of that too," right? So that's really powerful.
Consistency is the second one, and this term I think needs a little explanation because you might misread it as saying you're consistent in the way you do something. Mm-hmm. What he's talking about is essentially using people's commitment to gain their respect, to gain their business, to gain their willingness to hear your position. One of the tricks that I learned early on in my public speaking training was if you ask the audience a question, especially how many of you or who has type of question, if you want them to respond, raise your own hand when you ask the question. If you don't raise your hand, very few people will raise their hand, so you're not really getting an interaction. If you raise your hand, people feel free. Oh, okay, yeah, me too.
Right.
Me too. And so that idea of getting their commitment to communicate, is effective in that way. It also leads to the next idea of social validation.
Right.
So, if people around me are raising their hand, and I feel that way too, right? Like, yes, I've overcorrected my students' papers. Right. Yeah, I confess.
Referring to the 4 deadly errors, right?
Yeah. The other thing would be now how many of you are willing to go out and try this?
Right.
Raise a hand. Well, if it's a good idea and people are somewhat confirmed or convicted and you elicit that response, right? Who's going to go try? Raise your hand. Okay. The fact that they did that is making a commitment to which they are more likely to be consistent.
Right.
Of course, a lot of sales and marketing people will use this technique on cold calling, When is a good time for me to get back with you? If they say a time, they're making a commitment to essentially be willing to talk to you at that certain time.
Right.
Rather than, would it be okay if I try to call you again?
Right.
Do you see the difference there? I think we had a whole session on this in our
in our
office not too long ago.
Yeah.
So, with writing, it's obviously a little harder to extract a commitment because you don't have interaction, you don't have gestures and facial response to judge. But you can presume that if you ask a question, people in their mind are going to say, yes, I should do that.
Yes.
That's your goal. Because if they make that mental commitment, they'll be more consistent in following through.
Well, and I'll just say to our listeners, because you're not seeing us, you're only hearing us, Andrew is literally raising his hand, and I feel so compelled to raise my hand as well. It's true.
Maria is not raising her hand.
She's taking notes.
Oh. So with the social validation, that's something that is just overwhelmingly human. All sorts of experiments have been done in this area.
Yep.
If you get someone standing up looking at the sky, and then you get another person standing up looking at the sky, and you got 3 or 4 people who've all been, planning to do this, you'll pretty soon have people who weren't planning to come and look up at the sky,
exactly,
standing near them looking up at the sky. So, we are very social creatures in a great way. And it's funny, we have this intense desire to fit in and to be individuals.
Yes.
That's probably the great angst of teenageness, right? Is you're coming into this world of realizing that I need to be like lots of other people so that I fit in, but I also need to be myself.
Right.
And how do we do that? It's part of the mystery of our creation. But in terms of a persuasive thing, you can apply to both of those sides. So I have got the perfect car for you because I know you and I know you would love this car. I mean, when I show this to you, you're going to say, that's me. And then at the same time, all the cool people drive this car. Right? So, you get that kind of weirdness there.
And we're all wondering what kind of car that is, but I guess it would depend on our individual needs.
Yeah, and so and it's not necessarily a bad thing. If we say, that we've done a poll and 82% of the teachers that have used our program in the classroom have experienced a very good result. Right? Well, that's a valid fact that also encourages people to say, well, maybe it's worth a risk.
Right.
Maybe I could become one of those that had very good results using this.
Right.
When you get into deception, right, then that's where we get afraid of this idea. One that I'm reminded of, because you and I are old enough to remember as young children, there were once, Maria won't believe this, but once upon a time, there were cigarette ads on television.
It's true.
Right? And I remember one, and it said something like, 90% of doctors who smoke Marlboro. Like, well, I guess then.
That would be the healthy cigarette. Wait a minute.
Yeah, where's the fallacy there?
Right,
I mean,
right.
It's perhaps a true fact, and I don't know if 90% was the real commercial. That's what sticks in my mind. But that's where some critical thinking needs to come in.
Right.
Is it even a good idea?
Our society today really capitalizes on this in that we're looking for reviews. Your mention of, 82%, well, that's 4 stars. 5 stars, I'll go to that restaurant. If this restaurant only has 2 stars, I don't think so. Hotel, yeah, we're very much, and it's so transparent now. We don't really have a choice. The public is deciding what that rating is.
Yeah. And, why did you buy the car you bought? Got good reviews. Yelp.
Right, exactly.
I mean, where are we going to eat? It's kind of cutthroat. It gets to a point where that, while it can be helpful, it can also be vindictive.
Right. If you have trolls on your website saying bad things about you,
or
you can't
you
control
are
that.
a professor at a university who requires students to come to class and read the texts.
And do their homework.
Do the homework and turn in papers on time and engage. And too many people don't like that, then that professor could get too many negative reviews.
Right.
And so, it's a double-edged sword, but, social validation. The next one I would think is, I guess if any of these were a strong point for me, I would hope that likability would be a strong point. I think in teaching, very clearly, if the students like you, it's just so much easier to challenge them, to talk to them, to expect more from them.
Yes.
So I tend to work on that idea of likability, and humor fits in. And we did a whole podcast on humor, didn't we?
Yeah, we actually did a 2-parter.
A 2-parter. So, anyone who missed that could go listen to some good jokes. But there's a science of humor, too.
So how would you incorporate likability in your paper?
Well, there's tone, right? You read something that makes you chuckle a little bit or makes you smile or makes you have an emotional reaction, brings up a strong memory, creates an image, all of those that touch on our humanity. like our whole humanity, rather than just our intellect. You can tell right off. You can almost tell as soon as you start reading something if the writer likes you, likes writing for you, likes himself, herself, likes whatever he's writing about. There's just this feeling, rather than, I'm going to do a detailed analysis of something I really don't care about. I think we see this for kids. If they're writing about something they're interested in, wow, the creativity explodes.
Yep.
If they are forced to write about something they are less interested or distinctly not interested in, they'll go through the motions, they'll do the sit-ups and push-ups, but they're not going to have that same zeal, and it won't come through in their writing as well. So likability, excitedness, in person, of course, smile is very powerful. There's a whole science of smiling. So how do you, we say that you can hear a customer service person smiling on the phone. So how does that smile come through in your writing as well?
Right.
Yeah. And I don't know there's a easy formula for that one.
Smile when you write. Hopefully.
Hey, experiment. Authority, we all tend to lean strongly toward appreciating authority. If someone has degrees or training or expertise that is evident, we're likely to take their word
right
more than we would say of someone else.
Right.
And this is, I think, an important logical training for students as well, is this appeal to authority. Is it really valid? Is, Madonna's opinion on trade wars or tariffs,
right,
as valid as an economics professor from Yale who served in, the U.S. Department of Commerce? Who knows? It borders also on the problem of the fallacy of origin. Like, that idea is bad because it came from a bad source.
Right.
Well, not necessarily, right? But when you're using authority, you can name drop appropriately. It can add to your case.
Right.
Right.
And of course, that's all you talk about that in papers, just citing credible sources.
Right. And more we are seeing the world demand, everything has to have a citation and or a footnote or an explanation, or it's almost too dangerous now to say something without the authority behind it.
Right.
And then, the last one is scarcity, which is a good one to come last at the end of a podcast where you're running out of time.
We are almost out of time.
Because then you would say, oh, if only we had more time and we could unpack this further, then what does that cause in people?
Well, they want to hear more.
They want to hear more. But you say, no, sorry, this is all we've got.
Right.
You're just going to have to come back some other time.
You have very aptly described scarcity without actually giving a definition. Very good. Very persuasive. So, as Andrew has mentioned, we are out of time. Thank you, Andrew, for this delightful conversation about the art of persuasion. I hope parents and teachers, you'll be able to use some of these principles, but perhaps more importantly, help your student.
We should give credit to the author, Robert Cialdini, Cialdini. He's got website. He's got whole books on this subject. He's kind of this pioneer.
Psychology and marketing.
Modern persuasiveness.
Yeah.
And what's interesting, of course, is so much of what he talks about can be paralleled back to the classical rhetoric training that was done. But anyone who wants to really learn more about this in a big way, I think should go to the source.
Right, indeed. All right. Thank you, Andrew. Thanks so much for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more, you can subscribe to this podcast in iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher, or just visit us each week at iew.com/podcasts. Until then, on behalf of Andrew Pudewa and the team at IEW, I thank you for the privilege of allowing us to partner with you on your journey toward better listening, speaking, reading, writing, and thinking.